Welcome. We're here with Ariel Steuer. And Ariel, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in wellness design?
Hi, Christina, and hi to all your viewers. Thanks for having me. So I'm an interior designer as well in Wisconsin, and I'd say I'd first became interested in wellness design in college through the route of sustainability, actually. And it was through my interest in sustainability that I started to see how much of what we now consider sustainable design has its roots in making spaces better for people, which now has sort of morphed into not just sustainability, but taking wellness from the gym and from all your activities and how you eat into spaces for people, which I would say is where it originated.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, that's how we began. We saw that there was a problem with
Mhm.
our behavior with the earth, and then it also translated to it was a problem for us as well, that the environments weren't always as healthy as they could be. So you also are trained in Vaastu. Can you tell us a little bit about that and where it originated?
Yeah, so Vastu is how many people understand it or can start to understand it. Is it's often confused with feng shui. It's completely different from feng shui. The two sciences likely emerged at similar times, although it's thought that maybe Vastu is perhaps a little bit older than feng shui.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's a lot of misconceptions around Vastu, even superstitions, you could say. And so the way most of the people who practice Vastu, the way that most people practice it is a lot like feng shui. Um, but the way I was trained is based on the actual ancient texts and the Shastras and what they actually say. And a lot of that information was lost due to colonization, the need to keep the information hidden and secret because it can be misused as well. It was also lost due to mistranslations. So when texts were rewritten into Sanskrit, a lot of the original meanings of words also got lost. So a lot of people think that Sanskrit is the oldest written language when it isn't. Um, the oldest Vastu Shastra texts, which is where the knowledge comes from, those older texts were actually written in an older language called Tamil, which is still spoken in southern India.
Mhm.
And then another instance that knowledge was lost was it wasn't being passed down because not only is there written knowledge, but a lot of the knowledge that's integral to how you practice Vastu was only transmitted orally. And so you needed both the written information and the oral tradition. Um, and so again, with you know, adding all that up together, you end up with a lot of misconceptions. And especially today, there's a lot of Hindu overlay and influence on Vastu knowledge, which is completely different. The Vastu texts are not religious texts. They're completely secular. It's considered a sacred science, but it without the religious connotations. And so there are a lot of practices within the Hindu religion that have their origins in the Vastu Shastras, but over thousands of years, it gets so far removed from its origin that um, it's no longer practiced in the same way, or maybe details are forgotten or lost. And so it just changes and is no longer what it originally was.
So where did Vastu originate? What part of the world did it come out of?
So it came out of the world of what we know today as India. It's thought that the knowledge is so old that it's actually pre-Indian, but that area of the world that we know today as India. So the lineage, and I mentioned that the knowledge was originally passed down orally as well as through the written text. And so traditionally, you would train under your father or your uncle to be a Vaastu builder and architect. And you had to also be of a particular clan known as the Vishwakarmas. So it was only that particular clan that built buildings and temples because they knew this sacred knowledge. And you wouldn't actually get into the practice of Vastu traditionally, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, until you had at least 15 to 20 years of experience working under your father or your uncle, or someone, a senior member in your Vishwakarma clan. And so it originates from India, and then the lineage that I come from, his name is Dr. Ganapati Stapati, and he's trained many, many people, and he's a very accomplished sculptor, architect, builder, engineer, even, because you also needed to know engineering to build buildings, of course. Yeah. He passed away, I believe, in 2011. But before that, he started AUM-S&T, the American University of Mechanics, Science, and Technology. And he appointed Dr. Jesse Mercé, one of his students, to lead it, to be the chancellor of the school. And it's based in the US and in India. And so we come from a respectable, noted, authentic lineage of someone who is of the Vishwakarma clan and lineage, who knows this knowledge. And Dr. Ganapati Stapati himself did a lot to advance Vastu knowledge and to clarify a lot of the missing pieces in Vastu. And he was also given the honor, I forget what year this was, but he was given the honor of India's Shilpi Guru by the President of India. And then also my instructor, Dr. Jesse Mercé, was given the honor from the Vishwakarma clan. She was bestowed as Vastu Ratna, which means the gem or the jewel of Vastu, which is the highest honor that any person outside of the Vishwakarma clan has received. Yeah. And so my classmates include students from all over the world as well, including Indian students. And we learn through the texts, through Dr. Jesse's 20 years of experience of both learning this knowledge and building. And it's also the only institution that not only teaches Vastu in its authentic form, but also teaches students how to build these structures, because that's a major differentiation between Vastu and Feng Shui. Feng Shui is often applied to existing spaces and buildings, whereas with authentic Vastu, you can only do Vastu by creating a building from the ground up. So that's the major differentiator, because if you think about a space, once a building is built, the energy that exists in the building, in the land, is there. It's not going to change unless you do some other energetic overlays to sort of remedy any bad or discordant energies. And that's a huge misconception with Vastu, is that you can just come into an existing building and make it Vastu compliant, so to speak, which is not accurate or correct at all. There's nothing in the ancient texts that say that you can take an existing building that was not built per Vastu and make it Vastu correct so that it emits all the qualities that you're looking for from a Vastu building.
And that is interesting, because a lot of times we do try to come in as designers and try to make it into something that it was not originally designed for. And we just think like, well, we can apply this and change this. But in the case of Vastu, it sounds as though that's just not an option in that case.
Right. Well, there's no mention in the ancient texts of applying like any kind of tool or, crystals or yantras or anything like that to make a space compliant. Now, What you can do with existing buildings with Vaastu is so what's important in Vaastu is the interior measure of the space, and because that is what creates the energy. And so if you think about an analogy I like to use is a stringed instrument, so like a guitar or something. You know, when you put your finger on the string of a guitar, you put it in a specific spot, which actually changes the length of the string because you're pressing it against the surface, and it creates a particular note. And then when you move your finger, you're again changing the length of the string, and it creates a different note. So the measure, or the quantity, you could say, is directly interconnected with the quality or the sound. Same thing in buildings. Whatever the interior measure or the quantity is of the space, that will give you very specific frequencies of energy or qualities that then affect you as the person living or working in that space.
Oh, it's very interesting. So is it, does a square room or a rectangular room, does that matter in this case?
It does. So if anyone's ever been in, say, a round building, there's no place for the energy to settle. So it's very appropriate for stadiums, for example, where you came there for activity. You know, you don't want the energy to settle. Or even a round dining table, for example. People are more likely to talk around a round table because the energy just moves more naturally with a round object. Same thing in a building. If it's round, there's no place for the energy to settle, and the energy is going to keep moving, which actually is not conducive to spending a lot of time in a space unless it's for activities, dancing, sports, etc. What's much more stabilizing for people, for all the activities that you do in a home or a workplace, is rectangular or square structures. So those are the most stable, because as the energy gets created always from the center, and that's sort of a universal, I'm just going to call it a universal spiritual scientific law, is that energy is always generated from the center. And same thing with a building, energy gets generated from the center. But then with a square or rectangular building, there's corners for the energy to settle. And depending on how the building is oriented in terms of the directions, the cardinal directions, certain qualities of energy are going to settle within each of those corners. And this can even be translated into the electromagnetic spectrum, where we call it the elements, so earth, air, fire, and water, with the center being the element of space. But that's more of a pre-manifested element. It's not like the physical fire or physical water. It's the pre-manifested quality, which relates to all sorts of different things. So water is spiritual, earth is very grounding, fire is good for creativity or cooking, air is good for storing grains, or a room for activity, for the air movement, the quality of the air. And this can even be translated into the electromagnetic spectrum, where it's known that infrared is in the same place as the fire element, for example. So then with those elements, knowing how they'll settle in a space, you can then plan the activities in those areas of a home or business that are conducive to the elements that settle there. And with existing buildings, you can apply Vaastu by measuring the space, seeing what kind of qualities are there based on the measurement, and then also seeing where the cardinal directions fall and what elements might be where, which might explain certain behaviors or certain ailments or things that people experience while living or working or spending time in a building.
So for example, in a kitchen, since it has fire, water, and a lot of different elements, they tend to have wood cabinets and stone countertops. What kind of energy would you work with Vaastu in that kind of room?
Yeah, so what's important really is I mean, materials are important, but from a Vastu perspective, the most important thing is the activity that you're doing.
Hmm.
And are there certain elements in the room, such as appliances in a kitchen, that would be more conducive to being placed in certain areas?
Oh,
So in a kitchen, in Vastu, ideally would be in the southeast, which is the fire element.
hmm.
And then you would place, and then, so there's the home or the building is based on a 9x9 grid, and that gives you the different zones of
Okay.
where all these elements settle.
Hmm.
And then, so that's the macro. And then you take it down to the micro, and you have those same exact zones in the southeast corner, for example. So in a kitchen, you'll want to put the stove or the cooktop in the fire element within the overall fire zone, because that's most conducive to the activity that's being performed there. And you'll put the sink in the water element within the fire zone of the kitchen. Does that make sense?
It
So like the kitchen
does.
is in the fire zone, and then on a smaller scale, you look to see where's the water element within that zone, and the sink will be the best. That will be the best place for the sink, for example, because that's obviously bringing water in.
So does that work in a renovation? Are you able to use that
And
knowledge as you're renovating?
yeah, it really depends on the individual building
Yeah.
and what's already present.
Okay.
And so if you have a building that is square to the cardinal directions, meaning this facade is square with, say, north, and then this facade is square with east or west, for like it's square, then it's most likely that whatever energies are present are going to be activated. And so you just have to assess on a case by case basis, what's the existing conditions, where are things already located,
Mm-hmm.
because we've been told as students, like there are Vastu consultants who will say, oh yeah, open up the center of your building to bring in the Vastu energy, which can be actually a very sort of dangerous thing to do, because if the energy of that building is not good,
Mm.
and maybe it's dormant for some reason, maybe because it's oriented at an angle which actually distorts the energy, but at least it's not completely activated.
Sure.
But by opening up the very center of a building that doesn't have good qualities, you're actually amplifying it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So there's not a one size fits all when it comes to Vastu assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And often we can assess a building based on Vastu principles, and there might not be anything that can be done. But one thing that can be done if someone has a little bit of land on their property, and they don't need a lot, sometimes a typical backyard is big enough, but you can also build what's called a Dhyana Garba, which is a small little building. It can be anywhere from, say, 6 feet by 6 feet to 11 feet by 11 feet. Is 11 feet as the interior measure is about the largest that you'd want to go.
Okay.
But if you put this Vastu compliant building on your property, that can provide the beneficial energy. And then you can also spend time in that building to receive all the benefits of the energy of Vastu, which translates into, your health, your wealth, your relations with friends and family. And the longer that you spend in there, you see the effects over time. It's not like a quick fix or anything. It's
Sure.
being dedicated to spending time in that structure and receiving the benefit of the energy. And the size of that structure, or even any Vastu building, is created specifically for the people that will be occupying the building. So it gets into astrology, essentially, or the nakshatra of the people who will be primarily occupying the building, so that it's the most compatible for the people living there.
Now, are there special building guidelines that go into that smaller building, or can it just be any type of frame construction? How does that work?
Good question. So the type of construction will actually determine how long that structure will hold its energy. So this can actually be, if you're into old homes, for example, but maybe you're worried about the energy that's there.
Mm.
Older homes, depending on their construction and when they were built, likely have an expired energy life, essentially.
Hmm.
And so obviously buildings that are built from materials such as stone or brick will hold the energy much longer, which is also why ancient temples were built with stone. And then when you get into wood, then the length of time that building will be energized is a little bit reduced. And then the material that holds the energy the least, although not done a lot today, is mud structures, but that can also translate into like rammed earth, for example, which is beautiful, but
Yeah.
it won't hold energy very long.
Huh. That's
So
interesting.
the more robust the material, the longer that it'll hold the energy of the building.
Okay. And does the energy just dissipate? So for a mud structure or hay bale or something of that nature, does the energy just dissipate back into the earth? Is that kind of the idea of what's not holding on to that
Well, some of
energy?
the energy actually does come up from the earth
Yeah.
because the building isn't seen as being separate from the earth, actually.
Right.
And so some of the energy does come up from the earth. Some of it does come down.
Hmm.
I'm going to say just from space or from the sky. It doesn't come from planets or anything like that. That's another misconception in Vaastu.
Okay.
And they meet in the middle, essentially.
Hmm.
And when a building expires, it just, you could say it dies, essentially. It just no longer has the vibrancy that it once did. It no longer, if you continue to spend time in that building, you'll probably notice that it just sort of fizzles out in a way.
And I think we've all been in those buildings before where you go in and it just doesn't feel like there's energy left in the building, and it's
Yeah.
just it's
Mhm.
been used and it's done.
Right, right.
We've
There,
all
there
been
is a
there.
way to re-energize the building, which is
Okay.
what they do with all the ancient temples, and I believe they still do it today to keep
Oh,
them energetically alive because they are a benefit for people spending time in them. But
yeah.
that's a very specific process that only a well-trained, very senior Vaastu architect and builder would take on. Usually,
Sure.
usually it was the oldest member of the clan who was also a builder that would do that work.
Yeah.
Because if you get it wrong, the implications fall on the person who was doing the work.
Right.
And so the logic behind it was, well, they're already much closer to death than say someone in their 40s. And so,
I suppose.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
hopefully they've had enough time to understand the energy and maintain that positive
Right, right. So they
lifestyle.
would also be the most expert.
Yeah. Good. Uh, and is there a way for our viewers to implement elements of Vastu at home? Is there anything that can be done to help, whether it's increase energy or flow or something that would relate to the Vastu um, practice?
Yeah, there's a few things that can be done. I've already mentioned the Dhyana Garbhas, the
Mhm.
small. We also call them meditation buildings because also that's typically what people will do in there. Although you can do other things like just reading or
Mhm.
doing yoga in these buildings. There's another version of those small buildings called a Shakti Garbha, which the energy is a little more energizing than a meditation building.
Hmm.
And so that's more conducive to activities like maybe it's a you make it your art studio
Hmm.
or some other hobby that you do. And then there's also what we call tabletop garbas,
Hmm.
where one of the faculty members at AUM-S&T, she's partnered up with a company who can make just little tabletop versions of these meditation buildings.
Interesting.
And because we have the measurements to go down that small,
Hmm.
that would be um, tailored to whatever your personal nakshatra is.
Mhm.
That would determine the size of that. And just having that in your home can bring that same kind of energy in as well.
Interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is it similar to feng shui in terms of, we can implement little elements of feng shui, whether it be crystals or elements of reducing clutter, things like that. Are there elements in Vastu that are similar in that manner?
I'm going to say no, just because I also want to,
Yeah.
cut that line of
Right.
the misconception that Vastu is like feng shui.
Yes.
And besides the things that I've already mentioned, which are, the small Dhyana Garbhas
Hmm.
on the property, the tabletop Garbhas, um, getting a Vastu assessment of your current home to see what energies are there.
Yeah.
Um, there really isn't much else that you can do. I mean, our instructor has also said that you can play what is it called? Music from Karnataka, so traditional Indian music, because it Vastu comes from this entire lineage of not just building, but yoga is of the same lineage. Ayurveda is from the same lineage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's certain art and dances that are from the same lineage of it's all spiritual science essentially. And so even the music, if you can find really authentic music from Karnataka, it also carries these qualities that you can then emanate into the space. And it's even been suggested that you can just have it playing on repeat on like a little boombox, or oh my gosh, I just totally dated myself by saying boombox, but on a
That's all
speaker,
right.
and just having it playing at a really low volume if it's not
Mhm.
something that you want to be listening to all the time, and that can infuse your space um, with just more uplifting energy. But you mentioned like clutter or crystals,
Yeah.
just in general, like clutter, it's typically better for most people not to have clutter around them. Although I
Mhm.
have come across people who they feel better when things are a little messy.
Yes, yeah, there are those people out there that
And
the
that's
less is,
okay.
yeah, the less is more doesn't work. More is
Yeah.
more, and
Yeah. It's more
that's okay.
comforting or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, this
Yeah.
has been very interesting, and learning about Vastu, it's such a vast topic that I know
It
when I
is.
went to take a look, I got a little lost because there are so many different elements to it, and it's so interesting to hear about because there are so many different building practices that we don't hear of very often, especially when they're coming from different cultures, and it sounds as though it's even a little bit lost in India. So it's
Mhm.
something that's making its way back, and it's nice to
Yeah.
see that.
Definitely. And if anyone is curious or wants to know more, you can go to the Aum S&T website, which is Aum science.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. And we want to thank you for being here. And if anybody would like to contact Ariel, do you have contact information so they can get a hold of you?
Sure. You can find me on social media. So the @ symbol with my name, which I think you can see here on the Zoom
Yep,
screen.
we'll have that on the screen.
And I can also send my contact information to you, Christina, that you can include in the description when you post the video.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thanks.